Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to Tradman. Ladies and gentlemen, another exciting episode. Bienvenidos, señoras y señores, a otra edición de Tradman, el podcast Catolicismo Tradicional Más Fina. Luis, welcome back, my brother. How you doing?
Hey, brothers, how are you? First of all, before we get started, can you guys listen? Hear me well?
We can hear you great. Can you hear us?
Absolutely. Perfect. Loud and clear. Very crisp.
Our good friend Luis Medina is back on the show. We're going to talk about a little known event in history that's known amongst your brother Catholics who are really excited about Catholic history. But there's a lot of people, even people lived in Mexico their whole lives, have never heard of this important event in Mexican history called La Cristiada. Sometimes in English we call the Cristero War from 1926 to 1927.
I was going to say, and it wasn't that long ago.
Right. It wasn't that long ago. And very important topic. But before we begin, in honor of those brave martyrs who gave up their lives and gained eternity in that horrible persecution, we're going to do an Our Father, a Hail Mary, and the Glory Be in Spanish. And so for all of our listeners, please feel free to listen along, pray along with us, and let's invite the divine blessing to give us an edifying discussion so we can learn more and more about these amazing heroes of our faith and this horrible persecution that happened in the late 1920s. En el nombre del Padre, y del Hijo, y del Espíritu Santo. Amén. Padre nuestro que estás en el cielo, santificado sea tu nombre. Venga a nosotros tu reino. Hágase tu voluntad en la tierra como en el cielo. Danos hoy nuestro pan de cada día. Perdona nuestras ofensas, como también nosotros perdonamos a los que nos ofenden. No nos dejes en caer en tentación, y líbranos del mal. Dios te salve María, llena eres de gracia. El Señor es contigo. Bendita tú eres entre todas las mujeres, y bendito es el fruto de tu vientre Jesús. Santa María, Madre de Dios, ruega por nosotros pecadores, ahora y en la hora de nuestra muerte. Amén. In the nombre del Padre, y del Hijo, y del Espíritu Santo. Amen. Luis, my Spanish, I haven't used it a long time, my brother. I hope I pronounced everything okay.
It was very pristine, and if you give me just one quick second, I lost some of my connection from my microphone. I'm going to plug it back in very quickly. You can even take me off the camera for one quick second.
No problem. We'll add you back when you're ready to go. Just give me a little thumbs up. Let's check.
This I think your Spanish was pretty good. I didn't hear any flaws.
So growing up out here in South Texas, you ready to come back?
I think so. Yeah.
Oh yeah, you sound much better.
There we go. Now we're in business. Man, thanks for inviting me over.
Oh man, we're so glad to have you. And I felt like we needed somebody who is, from the culture, who can help us a little bit understand not just the culture of Mexico, maybe even at that time, but a little bit of the politics, because that's going to feature heavily into why this horrible persecution happened. Before we jump into what the Cristero War was and why it happened, we need to sort of take, I think, people back in time a little bit. Yeah. So let's go back to, what do you say, the Mexican Revolution 1910, I would say, is probably because Mexico's gone through a series of political upheavals, revolutions over the time. But I think the revolution in 1910 is really what brings the current Mexican state, the current Mexican government into power. The 1917 Constitution and its various iterations are sort of based off of that 1917 Constitution. And I don't know, as a lawyer, I'm very interested in other countries' political systems and governments and how they structure these things. I read the 1917 Mexican Constitution and I was appalled, floored.
Wasn't there actually an earlier, now my research, if I understood it right, there was actually an earlier constitution that had similar language as the 1917, but it just wasn't enforced. Is that correct?
Sort of, yeah. If actually, let's go back a little bit further in time to the 19th century when this guy named Benito Juarez, was the president of Mexico. Leftists love to praise Juarez because he was the guy in charge of the laws of reform, or leyes de reforma. Basically, think of like the French Revolution, Napoleon, Mexicanized, in other words. So in that era, Juarez attacked the church, and this when Mexico parted ways from the government perspective with the Catholic Church, which is a big deal. Same thing as France, very Catholic countries. Well, and then history moves on. Then Porfirio Diaz comes, and then they want to move Porfirio Diaz from power. And William Taft actually financed the revolution, or part of it, pushes for the revolution. How? Financing. Think of it right now like dissidents in different countries, like Zelensky, for example. What we do here in the U.S., we finance an opposition candidate, create instability, and things go down the drain. Well, the revolution really took off. Unfortunately, we call it the tragic 10 days, the escena trágica to that period, because there was 10 days that were like extremely difficult for the life of Mexico and trigger a series of years, basically 10 years of civil unrest. To put it in perspective, while the world was dealing with World War I, and America ascending into the world stage, because he was not still the yet dominant power, but it was clearly ascending. In Mexico, we're like in a bloodbath, in a civil war. And then you have what's going on, different like heads of states, they're taking power over and over. Basically, it's like a big orc fight, essentially. Well, that's the best way I can describe it. Yeah. And believe it or not, during the revolution, there was a bloodshed. There's a very important moment that happened. So that laws of reform, obviously, because there's no revolution, there's no law. They finally settled down. In 1917, they reaffirmed the Constitution of 1917. The Constitution of 1917 essentially doubled down on the law of Juarez, of reform, that basically attacked the church. But you will ask, well, why didn't the conflict erupted back then? There's a simple explanation. They just came down, back from a civil war. Everybody was tired of the bloodshed and fighting. So even the government said, you know what? If we actually try to enforce this, it's another, civil war. We're not ready for it. Even the U.S. is like, we're not ready for more. You guys need to settle down. But before we get into the Cristeros, let's make a little parenthesis here. In that revolutionary era, a very important event happened, worldwide and also in Mexico. In 1914, Mexico was actually consecrated to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. That, that's my 2 cents, actually set the tone, the spiritual tone, if we want to put it that way. And Mexico was going to pay that price, spiritually speaking, and later actually in blood, as we, history teaches us. But like in 1914, right in the thick of the revolution, during Huerta's, this guy, General Huerta's presidency, which he was like a merciless guy, when he was in power, the consecration happened. The Sacred Heart of Jesus was basically what France failed to do. Mexico was able to do in the middle of chaos. Spain did it later too, by the way. Spain did it like 3 times, as a matter of fact, in 3 different eras. Well, finally, the dust settles, right? And you have the Constitution. It's approved. And one of the few benefits that the Catholic Church still had before the 1917 Constitution was, okay, at least you own your temples. Well, your churches, your sanctuaries. The Constitution said, guess what? They no longer belong to you. They belong to the state. The Catholic Church said, okay, we'll play nice, kind of roll over, I guess. And time went on. Well, there's now the story of this, and I'm going to tell you a little story about Calles, because when we talk about the Cristero War, as we know it in Spanish, Cristiada, the Cristiada, it's a lot more complex than people think. It's easy to pick villains very easily, or blame sides very easily, whether it's the government or the Catholics or the extremists or whatever it is. It takes a little more detail into that. And we were going to look at some of those players that and their actions and how relevant they were. So Calles, who came from the revolution, by the way, era, comes into power. And he obviously says, guess what? We have a law and we're going to apply it. There's a new sheriff in town. And we know the story. We've seen the movie, which the movie is not necessarily very accurate in a lot of ways. It's faithful in a lot of ways, but it's not necessarily super accurate in others.
It's a dramatization.
It's
you
a
have
dramatization.
to expect kind of that kind of thing. Yeah,
that happens. Just like they're proving, I haven't seen it obviously because he hasn't premiered the movie of Father Amorth, like the Vatican.
Yeah.
I mean, we appreciate the attempt, but I don't expect something super faithful, and that's all right. It's entertainment. So,
I kind of laughed when I saw Russell Crowe as Father.
Yeah,
I was like,
he does not look like anyway. Yeah,
anyway, I'm not gonna.
Yeah, I wonder if they're gonna do a movie of Father Ripperger. We know they're gonna pick a guy with full head of hair or something like that. Like, dark beard. It's like,
hey, maybe he'll convert. It happened with Shia. Who knows, right?
Well, yeah.
Well, so going back to before we get into Calles, because I want to talk about, because we live unfortunately right now with a failed narco state at our southern border.
Yes.
And people have asked for a long time why are there constant political unrest in Mexico? I have a theory, and I think it's something we ought to talk about, which is if you took the landmass of Mexico and you transported it up north, if you laid it over our country, it would stretch from the middle of Canada, and the bottom of it would be down near the Florida Peninsula.
Yeah.
And they have always tried to govern that whole landmass from the federal district.
Yeah.
And it is impossible. The only reason the United States is able to have any semblance of government, which I don't even know if that's true anymore, but is because we have 50 states, each with their own municipal governments and things like that. But the Mexican model is very centered in the power of the federal government.
That comes from the Spanish, and specifically the Spanish when the Bourbons took over, when the French took over, not when the Habsburgs were in charge. And that's a different story because this is about Mexico, not Spain. And I know there's a debate about the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were horrible in a lot of ways. Let me put it simply: if Charles I, or known as Charles V, from the Habsburg dynasty, would have brought Cortez, Luther would have a different fate. Cortez would have settled things very easily and very masterfully. But anyway, that's a different story, different podcast. We can talk about it later. Mexico's centralized idea came from the French centralized idea that passed on to the Spanish, and then by the time when Mexico rebelled against Spain, or New Spain rebelled against Old Spain, and then Mexico was born, because that's the story of Mexico. Mexico has been around only a couple of centuries. So the country, trying to govern that big piece of real estate, even when they lost half of the states, half of the country to the states, it's still a big chunk of real estate. And on top of that is desert mountains on the north, the only livable space is the middle, and then jungle in the south. In America, to put in comparison, we are blessed with incredible geography because we have arable land known as the Midwest. Also, we have ports in the south, and then we have, mountains in the west, which is high desert. But really, the bulk of the population is on the East Coast anyway. So that makes things a lot more easier to manage from a geopolitical standpoint. Mexico's the opposite. Basically, Afghanistan is the only country that has a worse geography than Mexico. So trying to control that from one central location, it does not really apply. Right. There's no shocking that the Spaniards were able to control New Spain with a different system, right? Like was fueros, the local autonomy is just like here in the States, right? You have local government, state government, and local rights over state rights, and so on, goes from the bottom to the top. I'm not a lawyer, so you can explain it better than I, but it works for a reason. It's not necessarily, the whole country is not Kansas, so you got to do something.
Subsidiarity, like exactly. Our Catholic social teaching tells us, is the better model. Yeah.
Absolutely. So that makes Mexico to govern really, really hard. And on top of that, you have a culture that has been infiltrated, let me put it that way, from revolutionary ideas. And I mean revolutionary from the French Revolution. Often people mistakenly blame the British for a lot of the ailments that has happened to the Catholic Church, or with the Hispanic world, because the British and the Spanish were at war a lot. And they also cooperated a lot. That's what people don't tell us. Like the actual worst influence we had, the most damaging influence has been the French. Till this day we're paying that. Yeah. Oh yeah, by far. I mean, the French, up into America's ascendancy to power, French was actually the diplomatic, like the lingua franca, essentially, so diplomacy, even our forefathers spoke French, because that was it. That was the language. Well,
it's still the international language of international law. It's the official language of international law is French.
And France is considered the eldest daughter of the church. So it's got a very
now Jason
Catholic
and I
history.
We're talking about this, and how Freemasonry comes to Mexico is a little different than how it comes to the United States, and that the Scottish Rite version that we typically see here in the United States, while it is true we cannot be Catholic and be a member of the Scottish Rite,
that's right,
they are not quite as militantly anti-clerical or anti-Catholic as the French version that made its way to Mexico. So in we're 15 minutes in. I want to go ahead and get started into the war because I'm excited about some of these heroes. It pretty much, from what I can tell, kicks off mostly in the state of Jalisco. I mean, that's where it was the most violent, although there were outbreaks of action in Michoacan, Guanajuato, and some of the other areas. What kicks off this where does it, what's the tipping point that
I think it was Lenin who actually said this, that once the thin bloodline, once it's crossed, you can never go back. So in other words, his blood was spilled and then things never came back. And I'll tell you why it was spilled in a second. The areas, by the way, whoever's watching us, the states that we were mentioning, like Jalisco, Guanajuato, and all the other states, they're located in central Mexico. And Jalisco is in the far west central part of Mexico, is where the city of Guadalajara is. It is essentially it's Mexico. Anything about Mexico is most of it comes from that area. The mariachis, the charros. What culturally was Mexico, it emanates from that state, and Catholicism is one of those. Guadalupe might be the spiritual center, because obviously it's in Tepeyac, in Mexico City area, but the cultural Catholicism comes from Guadalajara to the whole country. All right, so. Okay. It made sense that the people there rebel and fought the easiest. What happened is that Calles comes to power, and he says, okay, we got a law and we got to apply it. And one of those laws stipulation was we need to do an inventory of the churches. Priests need to be registered in the National Archives, essentially. And so he's basically started regulating the church, and also created a National Catholic Church, essentially like an Anglican church, but Mexican version. Guy just had an animosity towards faith, which we're going to explore a little bit later, and there's a reason why. This is where I come explaining the Cristero War in a little different angle than most people, because we got to broaden the horizons here. It's not that I'm justifying it, but it helps us understand, where things emanate and stem from.
Good, because I'm so excited. Calles is one of the most interesting figures in this whole thing, and I've often wanted to know more about why he is the way he is. So I'm really glad you're going to talk about that.
And on top of that, go ahead. Sorry, Jason.
No, I was going to say I'm right there with you both. I took a little note so that we made sure to circle back to that, because I'd like to know what his animosity towards religion was.
And I have a 2 cents, like a theory why his animosity was, exacerbated that, but we'll talk about it later. Anyway, so the church says, the state says, hey, we got to do inventory. Priests have to register, and you can no longer teach in schools. Monasteries are forbidden, by the way. So a bunch of anti-clerical laws. The Pope was Pius XI at that time. So they bring reports to the Holy See, and the people don't like it. And the Holy See is like, okay, we're gonna keep an eye on this situation. This is not good. Well, they talk to the Mexican government. The Mexican government is set in their ways. We're going to go with it, whether you like it or not. We're the government, and you're going to listen to us, period. And the Holy See basically says, okay, the request of some of the most conservative, radical, Catholics, or what is considered radical. I'm just using those terminology for the lack of, argument's sake. They said, okay, we're going to withhold the sacraments. All right. And the people will protest these laws, and the government will go back to its senses. Well, they withheld the sacraments. Now you cannot celebrate, the sacraments of confession, and we need that because they're means of grace. And the government's response to that is, okay, we have a problem here. We have a Mexican standoff, essentially, culturally speaking, because now you're not working. And remember, the churches, the temples belong to me, the state. And since you're not actually working, and you left the temples and you're celebrating mass in private homes, That's illegal. This is why we have temples and churches, so you can celebrate mass, because that's the whole point. We own it, but you basically forfeited that. And since you walked away from it, we're going to take inventory, lest you accuse us of stealing your crucifixes or artwork or whatever it is. So that's at least the government's official response. Fine, you want to walk away, it's because you choose, but we're going to close the church. Nobody comes in. We're going to send our own soldiers to take inventory, right? Revolutionary people, keep in mind, these are people who just came off the revolution. Think about it like a civil war. A lot of people who came out of the civil war, became governors or politicians or whatever, right? So they have this violent frame worldview. And as they start going to some churches, they were hoping the churches would be emptied. Well, they find a lot of people in churches. And here's where the blood gets spilled. When they say the people of the churches, you ain't taking any survey or any inventory over my dead body. So the soldiers responded, fine, be it your way. And blood was spilled. It was done by force. And once blood was spilled, the Catholic side said, now we got to respond. So it was like an organic, perfect storm. So Catholics started organizing in response to attack. And it became, for those 3 years, 2.5, almost 3 years, a war of guerrillas, essentially. So skirmishes and, battles here and there. And it was really bad and bloody. But it actually, believe it or not, that was not the bloodiest part. The bloodiest part was after the war technically was over, which we'll go a little bit later in this conversation. So they started fighting. There's no sacraments. This guy named Gorostieta from Monterrey, which is my hometown, started leading the Cristeros, you've seen in the movie too, which, by the way, a little parenthesis, in the movie, Gorostieta is portrayed as atheist and non-religious or careless, or at least with some sort of contempt, disdain to the faith. That's nothing further from the truth. He was actually a very faithful Catholic. As a matter of fact, I actually have in my channel Reconquista, I interview historian John Mayer. He's a French guy who migrated to Mexico before I was born, and became a doctor in history in the Cristiada. He's basically the highest authority when it comes to the topic of the Cristero. Mm-hmm. And one of the ironic things about the Cristero War is that there's really not a lot of Mexican experts in the topic. Most of them are foreigners. John Mayer from France. The other one is Father Javier Oliveira from Argentinian channel. He went and did his thesis in Mexico about the Cristiada. A lot of Mexicans actually ignore the story of the Cristero War. A lot of this knowledge came to surface with former Cardinal Iñiguez from Guadalajara, of all places, again, who revived these documents and started teaching them through the diocese to a lot of people. So anyway.
Real quick, is there a reason why Mexicans in general just kind of ignore the history of the Cristero War? Or
at the end of the Cristero War in 1929, they came with the agreements, the acuerdos, agreements in English. And one of those agreements, you're not going to believe this because, from the law perspective, was nothing written. But basically, they agreed on, we're not going to talk about this. We're going to keep it in the DL. You may celebrate your masses on your own side, and we'll do our, you do your thing, we do ours, and we're not going to talk about it. This is kind of like a touchy subject, to put it that way. That's shocking. There's a lot of things that I'm like, I cannot believe that both the church and the government did those things, when you start reading into it. And that's why, as simple as that.
Totalitarian governments have two options when they lose a war: lie about it or collapse. Those are your only options. You can either pretend it never happened, or you can admit defeat and collapse your entire system.
This is one of the beautiful things about our faith, in Christianity, because you see, not to divert from the main topic, but it's like you see in the Old Testament recordings of we screwed up, and we were idolatrous, and the Lord punished us because we misbehaved. Like, if there's any other religious text, only glorifies and lionizes the actions of the people who won, and the Israelites is the opposite. This is like one of the beautiful things about we really messed up here, and had the Lord not bailed us, we would have been gone, kind of thing. But governments do the same thing. Well, the Mexican government during the Cristiada was starting to lose the war, and essentially the Holy See is trying to do diplomatic relations with Mexican government, and at the end they said, okay, we got to come to an agreement. But the Mexican government says, I cannot save face. Essentially, I cannot retreat those laws. I can't say those laws. I'm not going to say, okay, never mind, those laws don't apply anymore, because that will be a public recognition of failure, which they were failing. So I was like,
this is not a government of the people by the people.
Exactly.
It's important to remember that. So, this isn't, the people's laws or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Which, by the way, you're going to find a lot of parallelisms with our current situation in a lot of ways. So, make notes.
Big time.
Big time. So let that be a lesson to all of us now.
I mean, if you want to go see what a government that treats its people like cattle looks like, go read the Mexican Constitution of 1917.
Yeah.
It will shock the conscience, because the church wasn't the only entity that didn't own any property. You don't own any either. The Mexican government owns your house. It owns all the means of communication, every newspaper, every radio, every television. It owns every school. It employs every teacher. I mean, and it's one party up until very recently that's doing all this. And instantly and interestingly enough, this is Calles' party that we're talking about.
Calles was the one who helped formulated, a lot of this idea of the one single party that lasted, the perfect dictatorship, as they call it, here in the U.S. when we were little kids, I guess.
Yeah.
So the Mexican government finally says, okay, we got to talk. And they made an agreement, the acuerdos. And the acuerdos essentially, literally by word of mouth only, nothing written on paper. The Mexican government says, okay, fine, you can celebrate Mass, and we're no longer going to persecute you, and we're going to offer amnesty for those who actually come clean and, give up their guns or their arms. Again, take note.
Yeah. And it's important to note that a totalitarian government doesn't do this unless you have forced them to capitulate. So it's important to know the armies of Christ the King took care of business in this conflict. My estimations have the strength of the Mexican government that threw at this problem 100,000 men, and they killed about 56,000 people. The Cristeros numbered about half of that, and took out about as many casualties as the Mexican government did. It was probably 100,000 people were killed in this war. So it was no small.
And we're talking about Mexico, a country with probably about 18 million people or something like that.
In 2 years. This wasn't like a 6-year long campaign. It's 2 years. But in those 2 years, some heroes emerged, and I'd like to get into some individual stories of heroism, and I want to talk about my favorite. This was when I first saw his face. It burned into my brain, and I think when you see it too, you'll get what I mean. There's something in his eyes that just has a gravitas or a seriousness to it. This is a man named Miguel Agustin Pro, who was born in Mexico, and I'm going to share my screen real quick, if y'all will permit me, so you can see what I'm talking about. And it's so, just look at his eyes. There's a seriousness there and a gravitas, like I'm here to do some serious business on behalf of Christ the King. So let me tell you about Blessed Miguel Agustin Pro. He began his discernment of his vocation. I don't want to say his discernment. He was in the formation process when the Cristero War breaks out. And he has to finish his seminary studies in Belgium, where he's actually ordained, and he joins the Society of Jesus there. He comes back to Mexico, and he makes his ministry being a priest during the Cristero War. And essentially, he's not taking up arms or anything like that, but he is a master of disguise. So he will dress as a playboy, he'll dress as a cowboy, a vaquero, he has all kinds of different disguises. Sometimes you'll see a handsome, well-dressed man walking with a woman down the street on his arm, and you won't think anything about that. But that's actually a Catholic priest hearing her confession. He would do stuff like this all the time, and he would travel clandestinely and say mass and give out the sacraments. His brother was a hardcore Cristero, and he actually was involved in some violence. His brother planted a car bomb in one of the Mexican government, some official or something like that. They see an opportunity to get Miguel for this crime, so they arrest him, charge him, and sentence him to be shot. On the morning of his execution, Calles decides to have a photographer there.
Yeah.
Because he says this guy's going to beg for his life, and I'm going to show it in the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
So there are the photographs of his execution are online. You can go and see them anytime you want. In fact, I'll try and pull some up while we're sitting here talking. But he essentially, the morning of his arrest and of his execution, he is taking in front of the I'm sorry, I'm going to go to my computer. No, I'm going to upload the file. I don't know how to do this. He's taken out in front of the firing squad.
Yeah.
He kneels down, as you can see here in this picture. That's an actual photo of Miguel Agustin Pro kneeling in front of the firing squad.
Yeah, because from what I understand, Calles was wanting to make this very public. So he had a lot of photographers and stuff like that. And obviously, I would assume it backfired on him pretty well, right?
He literally is the first martyr that has been photographed. Literally.
And this photo here that you see, this is Miguel Pro facing the firing squad. He has a rosary in one hand, a crucifix in the other, and it holds out his arms in the sign of a cross. And he says, "May God have mercy on your souls for what you're about to do, because you know I'm innocent, but I forgive you."
Yeah.
And then as they took ready aim and he yelled out, "Viva Cristo Rey!" That was the Cristero War cry. Long live Christ the King.
Yeah.
And he died in a hail of gunfire. And then they photographed that. And then they photographed the coup de grace. A soldier came up and gave him one to the brain.
Yeah.
They published it in the newspapers, and the funeral for Miguel Pro was like 700,000 people. And it was a huge embarrassment to the Calles government. And it was one of the things that actually ended up bringing about the defeat of Calles in this war.
With Miguel Pro, by the way, there's actually one of the key elements is when they accused him and his family of attempting against Álvaro Obregón was the guy planned the bomb. Actually, the guy who did it came forth and came clean, saying like, "Actually, guys, it was me who did it, admitted." But the government authorities were like, "Nah, it doesn't matter." I mean, essentially, they had an agenda. It's like, we want this guy, and we're gonna pin it on this guy because we're gonna make an example out of him. So everybody see. Obviously, as you mentioned before, greatly it backfired. Miguel Pro, Saint John Paul II was the one who elevated to blessed, right? If I'm not mistaken, right now, it's still not canonized. Yeah, verification is not canonized yet. We'll see what happens, as this process sometimes take a long time or not. Anyway,
sure.
So just like in Spain later, a decade later, in Mexico, and probably like in France with La Vendée and all these other places, where an scapular will get you executed, they will go, out there looking for rosaries and crucifixes, and at the height of this war, obviously it wasn't sustainable. And we're talking about a ratio where the government had all the guns, all the support, all the money, whereas the people were just doing guerrillas. The U.S. government actually was trying to finally end this conflict because they didn't want an unstable Mexico. They had bigger fish to fry at the same time. And the ambassador, I forgot his name right now, to Mexico.
Last name was Moro.
Ambassador Moro, was one of the key negotiators, despite the fact he was not Catholic. He kind of had a little bit of contempt sometimes with the Catholic, but he didn't care. He's like, we need to make these things happen. There was another key figure, was a Jesuit priest from America, who was able to also enable the peace talks between Mexico, the Holy See, and all these things. He actually founded the School of Foreign Government at Georgetown University, as a matter of fact.
No kidding.
Father Walsh, key figure. He was actually friends with General MacArthur and all that. Father Walsh was a key figure. Oh yeah, he was a key guy because he met a lot of people from the Holy See. So they were able to triangulate. Remember, at that time there were no diplomatic relations, so they didn't have a nuncio. They had envoy, or I forgot the name, an emissary, like a lower tier kind of diplomat there. But anyway, Father Walsh was crucial in the peace talks. But what the Catholic Church didn't do, essentially, was didn't back the Cristeros. In fact, once the peace accords came to be, again, not on paper, it was just a word of mouth, empty words.
Right.
One of the things that the Holy See demanded from the Mexican Catholics was, don't use the word Cristero anymore, because we do not endorse an uprising in the name of Christ. So there was a second war, but it was not as big, and they couldn't call it Cristero. It was kind of like a banned word. They just say, the Catholic Church says, you cannot fight in the name of Christ. You may fight for your rights, but not in the name of Christ, right? So kind of winking a little bit. But at the end, after that agreement, here's the other part of the other side of the coin for people who are watching us. Sure, the government made an empty promise. We're not going to persecute you anymore. And the Cristeros believed the government, and they started turning in their weapons. And that's when the actual bloodshed happened for the next 10, 15 years. After the peace accords, where the government was getting even against the Cristeros, under the understanding that the Catholic Church had their backing and everything's going to be okay, were basically being slaughtered by the government. And they were turning in their weapons, and that made it a lot easier for the government, literally. And you see those pictures where they're starting hanging a lot of the Cristeros in the telephone poles.
I was about to ask about that, because I've got pictures here about where you can see them hanging these men along the telephone poles and stuff like that. So that happened. That happened after the quote unquote peace.
Yeah, and right? Obviously a lot during the Cristero War, it also happened too. But the main hits happened after the war. I mean, after the peace accords, and it was a bloodshed. And Calles was gone. Even though he was still the power behind the face, he was not president and all that. Things didn't settle until this guy named Lázaro Cárdenas came into power as literally a socialist. The guy who nationalized the oil in Mexico and all those things. Basically, Mexico's Hugo Chavez from back in the day came into power. Things started to settle. Now, before we run out of time, I really want to make a pause and talk about Calles very quickly.
I was going to bring him up next, because I'm really interested in him.
Calles, and again, it's our favorite villain. We like to make it like the worst person in the world, and obviously he did a lot of atrocities and all that. We got to understand something here about Calles. Calles was born out of wedlock. And back in the day, the registries of birth and everything, the church had the records of, the census, who was born, who was baptized, who died, who got married and all that. And they were fairly, accurate records. That's kind of what the state was jealous of, because the people didn't care what the state said. A marriage didn't matter what the state said about marriage. As long as it has the blessing of the church, we're good, right? And so the state was very jealous of that, like we see throughout history, the conflict between church and state. Calles was born out of wedlock from a well-off-to-be father who obviously impregnated this young lady, and he did not want anything to do with him. Basically, it's like, your luck. So he's registered as a natural son, and pardon my language, I'm not trying to be offensive, but essentially it's kind of like a bastard, and his mom died when he was a toddler. So he was raised by his uncle. His uncle was an atheist and hated the church. So he was reared by his uncle all his life. So he always had this really tarnished view of the church because of his uncle. But here's the thing. Calles became a widow twice. And I guarantee you that, going through widowhood is not fun at all. I cannot imagine going through it twice in his life. So he actually had a lot of it's a tragic story of Calles, essentially. It's tragedy after tragedy. I'm sorry. But both of his wives were faithful Catholics. His children were faithful Catholic. He sent them to Catholic schools, actually. Some of them were exiled in the States. They went to Jesuit colleges. So clearly he has some conflicted feelings towards the church, because he, as far as we know, obviously only God knows, even after he left power, he befriended a Jesuit priest, and they kept close correspondence and all that. Even on his deathbed, that Jesuit priest was there. John Mayer told me this actually during a live show, and in hopes that he will repent and get the viaticum, at least the whole extreme unction, so he can die with the sacraments. He never did, as far as we know. Maybe he did, I don't know, but as far as we know, so he died without the sacraments. And it's very conflicting. So a lot of people when say, well, that darn Calles, such a devil and this and the other. Well, yeah, try to imagine growing up without a dad who did not want you, that rejection from the get-go. And the father is, humanly speaking, is a reflection of God in that sense. So in other words, our understanding of God really comes from a relationship with our fathers. That's why it's the devil's attacking the fatherly figures so badly for the last 50 years.
Well,
so,
and we have a lot of statistics that show how important the fathers are to children's faith and formation. I mean,
Absolutely.
it is significantly more important than any other person.
It's the one thing all my criminal clients have in common.
Yeah.
Without exception, every single one of them.
Unmistakably.
Was not.
Actually, I found a statistic. I don't know how accurate it is or not, but they say even if it's, and again, this is not necessarily the aim of the show, but essentially is when children are raised without a father, the chances, or you see this, of them becoming criminal increase dramatically. But if they raise without a mother, only with a father, they don't increase that much. There's something about, and I'm not saying that mothers are irrelevant, all that. Obviously, they are. We have our roles as God designed it, but there's something about the fatherly figure that is.
Women cannot teach us the skill set we need to be good men, and that's not their fault.
No,
that's it's just not. I can't teach a young girl how to be a woman any more than my mother can teach me how to be a man. I mean, it doesn't mean that young girls don't need their fathers, but you know what I'm saying? I mean,
and fathers deal with external world often, right? So in other words, a kid learns to survive because it's like that guy survives and whatever he's doing, it must be working. So I better pay attention, subconsciously at least. Whereas the mother often deals with the internal. When you reverse those roles, by the way, you have this distortion and messed up view. When the father becomes a stay-at-home husband kind of thing, or a feminized guy, essentially, and the woman becomes the alpha and the breadwinner in that sense, things get messed up and distorted. There's plenty of examples, sadly, especially in the Western world. Well, imagine Guy just knowing that his father didn't really reject it, didn't really like him, right? Then his mother died and he's raised by an atheist uncle. And then he looks at a church record and it literally says natural son. So imagine carrying that stigma all your life. Basically, you're hearing subconsciously you're a bastard. Who likes to hear that? No. I can't think of anybody who feels so proud. So this is my 2 cents, by the way. This is where I put my opinion exclusively. This is not John Myers or the Calles or anybody. I think when I makes a little bit of sense in that regard, now that I justify it, is Guy's attempt to attack the church was essentially psychologically, he was trying to erase his record, his birth record. So if I exterminated the church, there's no longer that reminder of that I'm a bastard. And I can see how that affected him. Because it's not necessarily that he had all the agenda. It's, again, daddy issues, for lack of better, if we want to oversimplify it.
Can I ask a question about Calles? I've always had this theory, and I want to know if you think it has any validity. One of the problems that I've always thought about Plutarco Calles is there's this thing. Let's give him some good intentions. There's something that happens to people when they get an over fascination with progress. The sentiment, my guess is around 1917, not just in Mexico, but all over the world, especially after what just happened in Russia. Religion is the enemy of progress. And that we get from our leftover from the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. I think we've realized now that isn't true, because anybody who believes if you just get rid of religion, people will become more rational and intelligent and everything. That's been disproven. Okay.
We literally see people mutilated themselves. Literally.
We become barbaric animals is what happens when we get rid of religion. But anyway, I think when I read Plutarch, when I read his speeches, I read his line of thought. He is so obsessed with this idea that we're going to take Mexico from this primarily agrarian society, and we're going to make them the industrial superpower of the 20th century by any means necessary. Lenin said things like that, and so did Joseph Stalin, and they ended up starving 36 million people to death in an effort to do this. There is this, and I'm not equating the two things, but I am saying sometimes when I hear modernists talk about Vatican II, I hear the same sort of but there's going to be all this progress. You got to understand, we got to get rid of all this old superstitious stuff so that we can literally transform our population into pure energy. It's like, dude, come on, man, that's not going to happen. Their promises get more and more grandiose and outrageous. And the only thing you have to do in order to achieve all this progress is give up all your human rights. It never fails. My human rights, for some reason, are standing in the way this glorious workers' paradise. But
this material wealth, yeah.
Do you think Calles was just one of his problems was he was just naively over obsessed with this idea of progress and all the things you can do to obtain it? Do you think there's anything validity to that?
Well, since you're asking my opinion, I think more than naively, actually, I think he was obsessed more like almost in a non-holy way. Again, I don't know, I'm not God, because of what that represented to that, the obstacle that faith represented to his ambitions and plans. And that's what I don't think he was stupid at all. He was actually very clever and smart. He was a revolutionary. He was a great strategist, as a matter of fact. And sadly, the underlying lesson for me is one action. When how big are the consequences of one sin, and that helps us to actually have a real scope of our sins. How important it is to acknowledge them, to own it, and to seek reconciliation with God. Because this guy who had sex with this young lady, and now he don't want to deal with the consequences of his actions, created this whole problem.
Very
essentially.
Yeah, very good point.
All because concupiscence essentially came into play. Again, it's not the end of the world. There's a price to pay, sadly and unfortunately, and all that. But like, I guarantee you, if this guy knew that his absence will cause it essentially all these problems down the line, I'm pretty sure he would have thought of it twice. But then again, there's no way of knowing during that time and that time of sin. And this is a highlight of grace for us, as Christians and as sinners, because like, no matter how deep and horrible sin is, it's always better to run to God after, we sin and repent than just trying to, walk away and make it even worse. Look at the consequences. We think it's just another child out of wedlock, out of thousands that are out there. Who knew this child out of the thousands who were out of wedlock, will cause so much pain in the country. So instead of, and also the uncle, I don't know what happened to the uncle, but there was not a guy trying to emulate Saint Joseph, taking a child, be a father to this kid instead of, he was handed to an atheist. Now, from the church's perspective, by the way, we want to clarify it too. There was no Vatican II back then. It was there was always a Tridentine Mass.
Right.
There were tradition all the way, and the vestments and all that kind of beautiful things. Mm-hmm. And yet, most bishops cowered and chicken out. And as usual, unfortunately, I'm not saying everybody. The priest is a little different story. So, what's the lesson here? A lot of the way it says, often you think is, and again, it pains me to admit this, the church will do what the church has done always, which is hide and, be afraid and not, you basically have to pull them into take their leadership roles. So there's nothing new under the sun in a lot of ways, right? Yeah. And this is important for us in America or the Western world in general, anywhere in the world, because we see flagrant, evident attempts against God and anything that is decent and holy. We have elites right now who are not just crazy; they're demonic.
They're satanic, man. Yeah,
literally. I mean, and we think our bishops and some of the princes of the church are going to come to our rescue. We're mistaken. Sadly, is God, and our refuge is God.
Christ is the only champion, and that's one thing that I tell myself all the time is because, I started this channel, and admittedly, I started this channel and some deep recess in my brain, I was going to save the Catholic Church with my little YouTube channel, with our little YouTube channel. Sorry, Jace. Like how I just stole your portion of the channel. But you have to constantly, and it's so frustrating when you're trying to save the Catholic Church all by yourself and it never works. And you're often part of the problem. And you have to realize Christ is the only champion. He's the only one who can do battle on our behalf, because we can't, the most intelligent being that God has ever created has done nothing since the dawn of time than think about how to drag your soul to hell. And you are outmatched in this fight.
Well,
don't get it twisted.
I want to piggyback on a couple of Luis's points that he said here is, and I agree with you that, all this, that happened, of course, was pre-Vatican II, because I think sometimes, myself included, sometimes we have visions of the past that aren't accurate and aren't real. I mean, it's not based in reality. Yeah. And like you said, there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, and you mentioned earlier in the show about how in the Old Testament we see all these we see all these Old Testament prophets and people and all that, and kings like King David failing and sinning and doing all these things. And like you said, they're there for a reason. They're there to show us, hey, when we fail, it's because of our concupiscence, because of our falling nature, and we are going to fail. But we can either take the road of someone like, say, King David, ask God for forgiveness and move on trying to obey God, or we can do like some of the others and just completely run out into left field. and your opinion on Calles, I actually could relate to that in some ways, in the sense that, I say relate, I mean like people that I know through other people, in the sense that, he was trying to erase like his history, his background of being labeled a bastard child, not, having all these,
just doesn't fit in society.
Just to be in society as accepted, because we don't realize today that being a child out of wedlock is, as long as
it's the norm now.
Well, just 50 years ago, you would have been ostracized. At least your mother would have. From society.
No communion.
And I mean, just society as a whole, just out in secular society, but. Because I know people that have said they have either left the Catholic Church, through my past life, because they're like, well, the Catholic Church said my mom couldn't get remarried, for instance. So why can't she get remarried? Because they don't want her to be happy. So I blew the Catholic Church off for this, or, there's other reasons that people will blow off the Catholic Church. So I can see that through experience of knowing other people, that, that's a very viable option, that Calles says, hey, I'm going to try to rid the Catholic Church to make myself feel better.
Yeah, to clean basically my dirty name. Again, I mean, that was outside of his control. I can understand him from a widower perspective. Unfortunately, I went through that once in my life, and I'm like, okay, that I can. It's kind of like the opposite of the coin. When you become a father, a lot of things make sense. I don't know if y'all have the privilege of being a dad, and you just get that immediate knowledge where, like, my goodness, he was there all the time. It's just I needed the kids to see it now. Widowhood is the opposite side of that coin, essentially. You see a lot of things. Now, one of the dangers of widowhood is that it can be very enlightening, because you see things as they are, and you realize things that matter and actually things that don't matter anymore. To give you a quick example, it's like, I had a friend who complained about his wife, and I'm not going to name, obviously, but like, my wife, it's just not pretty anymore. She got fat and all that. And I can see, his grievance in that sense, but I'm like, dude, I would love to have that problem. Here I'm burying my wife, dude. It's like, I will trade your spot. I don't care if my wife is fat and that, because you realize you love the person more than whatever the appearance is. But then again, not that you wish that they go through that so they can learn that lesson. The problem with widowhood is, because you can see so clearly, you can become very hardened and very cynic. So this is one of the moments you got to cling to God, because this is what keeps you soft. You can get your heart hardened very quickly, because you don't have time for BS, essentially.
Oh, it can make you incredibly resentful, I can imagine. I mean, just resentful and angry, and I've noticed that when you
imagine
bog down in resentment, I mean, evil is right around the corner.
You lost your partner, dude. Like, you have to reinvent yourself. Now God comes into the picture. You cling to, that's the moment you cling to God. But then you have a guy who does not believe in God, and then marries again, and then widows again. And his second wife is actually a younger wife, a young girl. A young woman, a girl, obviously. Which is obviously harder to watch, because one thing is a grown-up adult, it's still hard no matter what, but another thing is to watch somebody in their prime die. I mean, man, that must be rough. So he goes through this valley of the shadows twice, and without clinging to God, there's no possible way you can make it through, like, mentally speaking. That's too much for any human being to bear.
Well, people get resentful for a lot less than that. Seriously, One thing I did want to touch on before we jump off is that, I had also read that there were two groups in America that were helping or going against the Cristeros that were involved with the Cristero War. You had the Knights of
Columbus, yeah,
which apparently lobbied the U.S. president to intervene inside of the Cristeros, and even I don't know if they gave him money or they tried to give him money.
They gave him money. They housed priests. They would smuggle priests back across, and then in some instances also funneled arms to the rebels.
Yeah. So I think it's important to bring up the involvement of the Knights of Columbus because they do
absolutely
a lot of good work even today.
And 4 priests who were brother knights were martyred and were canonized. And I don't remember what their names are, but
on the other side was the Klan on the other side, actually. Which at that time was super big here in Fort Worth, where I live, which is ironic because Fort Worth is one of the, at least for a while, it's the fastest growing Catholic communities in Texas too. So we have a Latin Mass now. We have an ordinariate. We have, like the cathedrals in Patrick, all these things. So anyway, wars are complicated thing, right? And if we bring it, because a lot of people may ask, well, why would I care what happened to some Mexicans 100 years ago, right? Fair question. Is because out of those lessons, we are sadly gonna have to draw on some of those because we're gonna live, whether we like it or not. This is not trying to be negative and bring you down. We're gonna live. Unfortunately, in our generation, sooner or later, the time where we're going to have to actually mean what we believe. And it's clear that from a governmental perspective, not just this country, globally, there's a clear aim to eradicate any trace of name of God. And you see it as Laura Logan said, the journalist, famous journalist said it in one of their interviews. And she's right, saying like the people in power want to erase any trace of God, and it's centered first and foremost in attacking children, because according to them, the children is the closest thing that resembles to God because it's pure, right, innocent, and they don't like that. They want to be, the take that place of God. So in other words, for us means like it's just a matter of time, unfortunately, where our government, just throughout human history, again, it repeats, or rhymes at least, we're going to have animosity towards the faith. And there's a very key point I want to emphasize before we sign off here. Part of the reason why the Pope Pius XI was ready to make peace is because he started getting reports also that the Cristeros started becoming violent too, and kidnapping started going up, and ransacking, and they're starting crossing the border and stealing horses, and so. Here's an important lesson. Be careful how you react against adversity, because if you engage in violence, sooner or later, you're going to start permeating the way you see things, and you start becoming like them. The way usually the church combats a lot of the hostilities is not necessarily through violence, at least not always, or at least it's not the most effective most of the time, all the time. There's a place and time for such things, but in a prolonged state, it's going to start corrupting you, and the Cristeros were no exception. Again, think about like the Civil War too. A lot of the people who were the war was gone, they became guns for hire in the West, essentially. Right. A lot of our veterans here, they were done their tours. Some of them become mercenaries and they're fighting in Ukraine or Afghanistan, whatever it is. They're doing private services and security. Some of them they miss the action, and I'm not saying they're bad people or anything. It's just be careful when you engage with violence and you think this is just going to be momentary and it will not affect me. It reminds me a lot when I see the Cristiada and the Cristero side. It reminds me a lot of Lord of the Rings. Remember like the movie or the people. If I get the ring, I will be different. In other words, if I engage in violence, it will be only for justice. And it's like, oh, you don't know that. I mean, very few people can probably withstand that. So for us Christians, we got to be very careful in engaging in violence. Because we might end up becoming what we hate or we fought. And obviously, we need to be very meek and hard, because this is what Christ calls us to be. This is not to say we should be doormats or be trampled. As men, particularly, we have an obligation to protect ourselves and our families. There's nothing that I want to have to do with anybody who wants to harm children, as we see in our country right now. The point here is this is a little more complex. We got to involve a lot of prayer, a lot of dependence on Christ, and we really got to look at perspectives from a broader view in order to analyze those situations that are difficult. We might face those in the future. I pray that we don't, but it seems like certain authorities are very demonically obsessed into just attack the children. So at some point we gotta figure out what we're gonna do.
And it's not different than it was in Eden. I mean, people have looked at that story about Adam and Eve, the fall, and said, well, what's the big deal? They ate a fruit from a tree. Who cares? But here's the problem.
Yeah.
People, our fallen human nature, we have this thing where we want to be God. It's not good. It's a very disordered thing where we want to be the deity. And you might think, what's the problem with that? Why can't I be a God unto myself? The problem is that from Eden to the Soviet Union, people who think they're God abuse people.
Yeah.
They do. God put that angel with the sword guarding Eden, not to keep us out of Eden, but to protect Eden from us. We had become lethal. And the thing about these people who proclaim themselves to be deities, when you won't worship them as they feel they deserve to be worshiped, they throw temper tantrums. They get mad. They kill. They start holocausts and holmidors. And, this is and every single one of these people, you got to understand, I'm doing it for justice. I'm doing it for progress. I'm doing, subject yourself to Holy Mother Church, because you're not as an old Irish priest once told me about mortal sin. He said, you're better at it than you think you are.
Yes. And here's one of the, speaking of weapons, and I'm going to do a shameless plug. My aunt brought me this rosary from all the way from Spain, the Cross of St. James. I don't know if you can appreciate it there. This is your first and primordial weapon. It's not the only one, but this is the actual weapon. And you'll be surprised at the power that prayer and God, acting upon those prayers will have. Often we think I'm better handling, thugs with my own guns and all that. Often I hear many stories of people, again, who were prepared, were packing heat and all that. This is not necessarily the conversation for that topic, but who rely on God. It's the story of the Israelites. When they started trusting themselves, things went bad. But when they let God do the battles, then everything went well. It's the same for us. Sooner or later, what we're seeing right now, certain truths started coming out about certain actions from our government right now. It's just that trust in divine providence. At the end of the day, that's the lesson of the Cristeros. You got to trust divine providence, and He will make it right. We will see. It's our turn. We're grown-ups now. We're the adult generation of this era, and we're yet to be tested. We'll see how we respond.
And it's in situations like this that we really see who backs up their talk, right? Because a lot of people in times of ease and prosperity, they talk about, I would do this and I believe this and whatnot. Well, when your beliefs are put to the test, that's really when you see, do you really believe what you preach, or are you just saying that because that's what you're supposed to say, right? So in many ways, we can look at that as a grace and as a good thing from God when we are tested, right? Because if we persist in our faith, not only do we become stronger, but hopefully we will make it to the beatific vision.
Yeah.
Amen. And I would like to invite all of our listeners to please pray for Mexico. We pray a lot for our country, and that's great. We should pray for the United States. The stories that come to us from our southern border are terrifying and heartbreaking every year. And one of the things that I tell people is, if you were standing out, let's say you were a hunter out in the middle of the forest, and every creature in the forest, every bird, every deer, every animal, every rodent, every insect started running in one direction, would you wonder where they're going, or would you wonder what the heck they're running away from? Until we get serious about helping Mexicans create a government of the people, for the people, and by the people that they can meaningfully participate in. Nothing we're doing, there's nothing to be done at the southern border. I don't know what you're going to do. How do you stop a migration of 7 million people? And you've got to wonder, why do 7 million Mexicans not want to live in Mexico anymore? Well, I ask that question. And because I know most people would rather be at home. I don't think they're at the southern border dying of dehydration because it's fun.
Yeah, it was let's start this hobby. Well, George Freeman said the last decade, that he did a study between 2000 and 2010. That's a long time ago, because the drug trade between Mexico and the U.S. is $500 billion. $500 billion. So, and that's 15 years ago. It's probably high now. So in other words, you don't have enough money to stop that. You can't fight it with money and guns. You can fight it with prayers, that's for sure.
And let me dispel a myth. Mexico is not a poor country. Everybody thinks Mexico is a poor country. It's not a poor country. It just so happens that 98% of the wealth is concentrated into the hands of 2% of the population, and everybody else can eat rats for all they care.
And they don't care.
That is so unjust.
Which we're seeing right now with our government too, right? Like, hey, dude, inflation, hey, insecurity.
Yeah, we're adopting the model Mexico adopted 80 years ago right now. So we might want to wake up and
the Holy Father said like a few years back when Pope Francis went to Mexico, and he pointed out something really that caught my attention. Talking about Lady Guadalupe there, and he pointed out to the Tilma and said, the devil will never forgive Mexico for this. And essentially is, in other words, says Mexico, because of Guadalupe.
Interesting.
Well,
that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
Spiritually speaking, we'll be at the crossroads. And it's the country that actually, by the way, abortion, they're pushing it a lot. It's still, even though it's legal in certain states and all that, is one of the countries that aborts the least. But in other words, Mexico is at the crosshairs of the spiritual battle. And because we are neighbors to that country, it's in our vested interest to pay attention to what's going on, because we don't want stability. Now, America has been also consecrated to the Immaculate, believe it or not, in the 1800s. America, by the bishop, was consecrated to the Immaculate to the Immaculate Heart, just like Spain. So we share that bond in that sense. So it's a Marian country, just like Mexico, just like Spain. So that means that we're going to be at the crosshairs as well, the spiritual battle. So we better wake up. And we're looking, before you lose any hope, essentially what's happening is Our Lady, she's claiming the territories that belong to her. And you see it in Guadalupe. Guadalupe is not a Mexican phenomenon. It's a world phenomenon. And it was technically a Spanish phenomenon, not even Mexican. No. And Mary is saying, I'm getting my land back, right? And that includes America, that includes Mexico, that includes so that's going to come with a price, just like when Mexico consecrates the Sacred Heart, just like Mary's reclaiming her land, and that's going to come with a spiritual price. And we better gear up because it's going to be steep.
Yeah, no,
here.
I mean, you said you mentioning what Pope Francis said about the devil not forgetting, Mexico because of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Mm-hmm. It really does, as men of faith, it really does put the issues Mexico is having in perspective.
Oh yeah,
I mean, it really does.
Yeah.
But before we go, I just wanted to mention somebody in the comments. Cruz came in. He said he came in late, but he actually made the comment, as a person of Mexican descent, he never learned about this, the Cristero War, until the movie came out. Then he asked a friend who is considered Mexican. I'm not sure what considered Mexican means, but because he was born and and raised, he said he had never learned about this at all in Mexico. It was kept hush. That actually, I told him that we answered that why. So I actually might make that a clip. So it was I just found that comment really interesting, because earlier we had discussed, well, why don't they talk about it? And I think it's crazy that it's just like a formality, really, if anything.
Correct. The reason they don't talk about it is because the atheists consider Jesus Christ that dangerous.
Exactly.
His name is not even to be uttered. They're that terrified of him.
Well, this in spirituality, and we see it unfortunately in a lot of social media too. When it comes to faith matters, if you're not ascending, you're descending. There's not such thing as I'm indifferent to Christ. Either you love him or you hate him. And a lot of people are like, I don't care. Your actions demonstrate the opposite. It triggers you. And that's why I see it all the time. People who are like, I'm agnostic, like, yeah, you hate Christ. It doesn't bother you about any other religion, but when it comes to Christ,
absolutely,
that's when you jump. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and did you have anything else to add to it, Mark? Because if not, I was gonna tell Luis, thank you for coming on the show. I know I didn't add a lot to the show because I'm not well versed in the Cristero War. It's kind of,
you are so hard on yourself.
No, man. Yeah.
No, I'm not being hard on myself. What I'm saying is I appreciate Luis's knowledge on it, because
I thought I knew a lot about this. I didn't know half as much as Luis knew.
Yeah, I had an overview of the background, but and we didn't even get into all the nooks and crannies of the story, right? I mean, there's probably so much more to it, but I feel that this story, at least what we covered, there's a lot of aspects that we can relate to in our lives today. And you did a good job of bringing that out, I thought. And it also, in a lot of ways, hearing about these martyrs, hearing about the faith of these men really does. I mean, I know it sounds cliche, but it really does bolster your faith, saying, you know what, if the time comes for me to do this, I hope I have the courage of these men and women.
Miguel Pro is my confirmation saint, actually. I took
no way.
And here's what's great. Do you know Archbishop James Tamayo from Laredo, the Archbishop of Laredo, Texas? He was an auxiliary bishop here in Galveston, Houston, and he actually is the bishop who blessed Blessed Miguel Pro's shrine here in Houston, Texas.
No way.
The priest who was assisting him is the great nephew of the man who inducted Miguel into the Jesuits. And my sponsor was the head of Miguel Pro's canonization effort here in the United States. So it was the perfect trifecta of holiness. And so when I came up and you'd hand the bishop your piece of paper that had your saint name on it, he read out, "Blessed Miguel Pro." He said, "Oh, God bless you, Miguel." And he said, "Be sealed with the Holy Ghost." That was a great moment of mine. And Miguel, Miguel has been with me since I turned 16 and I wandered into his shrine, and I talked to the guy who became my sponsor, and he told me the story of Miguel Pro. And I wasn't even really a practicing Catholic yet.
And it's in a bookstore. It's in a bookstore, right?
Yeah,
if I'm saying the right one, yeah.
Yeah, St. Francis of Assisi Religious Goods. Now, that same couple doesn't own it. A new person owns that store now, but the shrine is still there.
Mm-hmm.
St. Francis of Assisi Religious Goods on Highway 6 in Houston, Texas. You can go there and visit Miguel, and they have all kinds of relics there and everything. It's really cool. But I want you to come back, because we're going to do a whole show on just the saints of the Cristero War, because we didn't get to talk enough about that. Some really great stuff. But really quick, we're going to close out because we are at an hour. I want to thank Luis Medina for coming back on the show. He's a friend of the show, and he's very knowledgeable about the history of this and other topics as well. We'll close off with a quick prayer, and we'll dedicate this prayer to Mexico. En el nombre del Padre, y del Hijo, y del Espíritu Santo.
Very quickly, can I add one more thing?
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course.
To everybody who's listening, please go to adoration if you can. And the most important thing I always say in my shows, Viva Cristo Rey y María de Guadalupe. Long live Christ the King and Our Lady of Guadalupe.
Absolutely. Te damos gracias, Dios Todopoderoso, de que vives y reinas por los siglos de los siglos. Amén. En el nombre del Padre, y del Hijo, y del Espíritu Santo. Amén. Gracias, señoras y señores. And thank you, everybody, for coming to join us on our live stream tonight. God save Mexico, and long live Christ the King. Thanks for coming.
Amen.